Hi, welcome to those who are watching this. Myself, Nick at Jankel, and my collaborator, Adriana Forte, are going to talk today about some of the issues around sense making in intense times and in times of grief and emotional challenge. And how we make decisions about what to do in these situations, inspired and activated by the situation in Ukraine, but not limited to that. But this video is a part of a broader series about, for me anyway, how we make sure that the feminine principle and feminine qualities, and we can unpack those and we will unpack those, are central to our consciousness and our action as change agents, as leaders, as thinkers, as intellectuals, as sense makers, and that we have a integrated dance within us all and within our communities of change and agency that consciously nurture a powerful dance between the masculine and the feminine.
Great, my go.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I'm happy to be here, and I noticed even a little bit of emotion arising for me when you said when you spoke about the feminine principle before me. I was like, oh, that feels so good to me. That it feels really reassuring, I think. So I'm really passionate about basically our connection is through wanting to support the dance of the masculine and the feminine in the world in a better way, in relationships and in systems, in creativity, it's everywhere. It's in the way we deal with our loved ones, but also in the way we deal with war and politics and finance. And so we can see everything basically through the lenses of the masculine and feminine principle. So we're going to be exploring this together throughout conversations, and we see this bit of our project as the masculine. So when we're going to be injecting some content or some of our thought provocations and things for people to be with and develop a relationship with our thoughts. And the feminine part of our project is grounding the project in how it lands for people. So having conversations, initiating conversations, or receiving feedback in multiple forms. Anyway, we really think it's important to have as much as bringing the feminine principle as a construct or an abstract idea as modeling it. So doing the project already as a dance of the masculine and feminine, me being a woman, Nick being a man, me having the masculine and feminine within, him having the masculine and feminine with him. And we just weaving with these principles together. And hopefully throughout different conversations, the idea is that we'll be exploring different topics each time we meet, and then occasionally deepening with the topics. If there's energy, if people are really interested, we'll have multiple conversations on a certain topic. And today we decided to meet on the topic of grief, which is, to me, is part of a feminine principle, is part of the feminine principle, is the part of being present with, being with pain, being with the pain of loss. Which I think it's it's very, very present in being a woman, in the physiology of being a woman, and we'll talk about that too, but also in we see it as an intrinsic part of that's necessary for creativity, for creation of, like when we're being with a difficult situation, just like now, the war, for example. And I'm noticing that I'm jumping right there, but okay, you can just weave with me. I'm just
Carry on.
Um, yeah, just being with war, we can operate from multiple ways and multiple places within ourselves, and in spaces that I've been navigating on the internet, there's a lot of discussion and meta discussion and meta discussion on the war. And what we want to do is also land the aspect of grief and just being with what's happening, and also not dismissing that it is very important to talk about what to do and to engage with practical ways to act in this war. We think they're both really related. We actually don't think that grief is an inconvenience or something that could get in the way of efficiency. And I think you have yeah.
Well, grief is super inefficient, right? But can be very effective at thinking better and clearer after you've paid attention to it. And I want to also start with the grief and really explore how strong intense emotions, which are honest and true to the moment, can either cloud or clarify or our sense making and our decision making, and then our activism. And as you said, part of this is about honoring in, I guess, the feminine mode, what is in the emotional space of what we're dealing with, the pain, the grief, the guilt, shame about the war, what we haven't done, our own stance, whatever. And then the movement towards, okay, and now what do we do? Which reminds me of the improvisational core of improvisation theory, and really enlightened practice is yes to what is, and now what we're going to do about it. So it's like this yes and, which I was talking about yesterday with my other main collaborator, my wife Alison, as acceptance and adaptation. So you've got this acceptance mode, which can take a long time. It's not like a 5-second thing, as we'll get into. And that's the masculine again going, can we just do some acceptance really quickly? And then we can get to the adaptation piece. So accept, adapt. And I just want to presence some very not practical, real stuff that occurred because of this conversation, which was actually in a community of thinkers where we actually met originally, like a year ago or whatever. So the Ukraine war occurred a couple of weeks ago, and it triggered a lot of very strong emotions and stances, let's call them stands, in this community of next level thinkers, next edge thinkers, which also created a lot of emotional stuff and some people acting in ways that probably inappropriate, probably diminish themselves and others. And we've seen this before, and we've actually met because I posted an article that you then read or you responded to, and then we met around this idea of where is the feminine in expansive, very complex cognitive thought. Where does it show up? Why is it missing? And part of that, as you said in the intro, is the abstract thoughts about the feminine around maybe more participatory approaches, more active listening, all of that kind of stuff, and loads of others, including loss and grief and releasing of ideas, all that stuff. But it also shows up in the micro moments of how we engage in dialogue or not, or whether we pretend dialogue is dialogue, actually it's discussion, or whether we pretend we are listening to each other to try and find a higher resolution idea, but actually we're just defending a stance because emotionally we have become absorbed. And a word you use a lot, I think it's from the integral circles, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we collapse inside. We come out of wholeness with these strong emotions. And of course, the one that we sort of are really weaving around today is grief and what that is. And let's maybe unpack what that is. But this is how it shows up, right? We're grief, we react to grief, we're angry, we're upset, we're enraged. I think a lot of people are outraged. I think outrage is one of the great emotions of our age. And I know as a thinker, practitioner, on multiple levels that outrage is what often spreads ideas and spreads memes and spreads podcasts and spreads things. But it's a really complex emotion to work with as an agent of change. And there's actually some research done by, I think it was Harvard, on New York Times stories and what type of story emotion creates the most shares. And anger and outrage was very, very high, but it's actually number two. And the only emotion that can out Trump, ironically, outrage, which people like Trump and Putin use in their narrative structures and, you know, the outrage of X, Y, and Z, is awe or wonder or like hope and possibility and amazingness. So I bring that in because it gives me hope that although outrage is a righteous emotion to feel when you're seeing children being bombed in a hospital, as it happened overnight, without processing it and the grief that comes up, that's deeper than the outrage, I think our sense-making skills are hampered and our collaboration skills are hampered and our choices about what to do about it become less varied and versatile, and we lock onto things probably prematurely.
Yes, I agree. You said a lot of things, but yes, to a lot of what you said. And I just want to add a personal story. I shared that with you yesterday, and I think it makes sense here. During this time when the war was starting, I was in the valley where I live, which was being flooded at that time. So, and before the floods, I had COVID and my daughter had COVID. So we were already in the house, in the valley. We lost internet connection and then we lost our phone line. So we were very insular.
Yeah.
We were complete insular. And I knew friends were telling me, because we would have to go to friends' houses to actually literally receive messages from my parents that were scared because I had COVID and I couldn't go anywhere because I was locked in my valley because the bridges were underwater. Anyway, I remember that I wasn't even connecting because of multiple reasons, but I imagine also the illness itself and the logistics of the family and everything else. I was just not connecting to, so my chest was very congested and I was feeling a lot in my chest and I hadn't completely processed. I wouldn't have named it grief. I wouldn't have named it, but there was a lot of energy here. And I went to this friend's house to participate in a call, which I hadn't participated in any calls because of the lack of internet. And I decided to join this group of friends, which are thinkers and beautiful people. And I entered the call late and they were dreaming basically brighter futures on education. And they were talking really abstractly, but beautifully. And I usually love engaging on that level. So it's not something I don't like, and it's not something I can't do. However, when I arrived so vulnerable and so raw and not even knowing that I was so vulnerable, and carried on talking from abstraction, I remember feeling just really fragile. I couldn't access any thoughts. I mean, that's basic what I'm saying, but experiencing it and going like, that's what happened. Like I couldn't engage. That wasn't available to me. And so I decided to leave the call and I didn't share with anybody. So I was leaving the call and then one person stopped the conversation and said, no, hold on, how are you? And as soon as the person, I remember thinking for a moment, like, do I want to answer? Do I want to be on it? Like, how much? Because I'm going to disrupt. So the first thing that came to me is like, what do I want to do with this answer? Because I'm going to disrupt here. I know that they're like flying high with beautiful thoughts and I'm going to bring a different energy. But as soon as I dropped in and I shared, I started crying and I cried. I think I cried for like minutes and I didn't even know those tears were in me. And when these friends happily dropped the abstract conversation, because they are people that can do that,
Mhm.
And they were like, let's just be, you're the most important thing now. Like what's happening now is important. You know, it's just right here. When they were there with me, I remember just really allowing myself connecting to this grief. And when they asked me, they're like, how are you feeling? What are you feeling? And it was just endless. It's late, 9 p.m. for me. You have to cut me some slack. Anyway, an endless, like it's almost like there was no bottom to my grief. Like I was connecting to such deep grief. It was for everybody that had died in COVID because it was present for me, for everybody that had fear that they wouldn't have help, for everybody that drowned in their own, lack of breathing capacity, for the war, and for the kids that were separated from parents, for everything. And it was so present in my heart. And as I watched them, I could feel that they were all feeling that with me, like we were all present, and the conversation changed, and the rhythm of the conversation changed. And the conversation didn't last for much longer than that, but I saw in me that was the only thing it took to if the conversation was going to last an hour more, I could have then engaged and been creative, because I was met where I needed to be met. So it's all, I'm just bringing the story here because, again, a part of what we want to do is to keep bringing it to experience. It's not just a beautiful idea that we have, it's actually we live those experiences, and that's how we know that they're valuable, those theories or those, yeah, anyway.
Well, I would speculate that had you as a group had time to all connect into grief, release something, be present in body and then in mind, the conversation would have gone back up to an abstracted, creative place, but in a different direction or with a different feeling, and therefore the outcomes would have been qualitatively different. And that's why it's so important to have this level of insight. And what I was reflecting on when listening to you and my own journey, I'll share some of my grief insights. I myself had a micro grief processing before we got on the call. As I shared with you, some pretty big stuff happened this morning in my home. And what this, I want to introduce a kind of thought that we can come back to and use if we want to. Because what struck me is, with the level of what we call, Alison and I call, embodied wisdom that I know you have about what is going in your body, what that state means, felt senses, interoceptive states, which is the feelings inside our body and the viscera, and then how that affects mood and emotion, because they're slightly distinct, but obviously a lot of complexity, and then how that thoughts affect our thoughts, particularly our cognitive biases, and then our behaviors, like, shall I say anything? Shall I run, depart? I don't want to interrupt. Or shall I pierce it and be really in everyone's face with my drama? And the fact that you, with the level of embodied wisdom I know you have, and me equally, spent 25, 30 years developing some sense of what's going on in me so I can interact better actually with others and be a better leader, coach, advisor, parent. And the fact you said you just didn't know how much grief you had makes me realize or re-realize just how hard it is to see how much grief we all carry around. We're so busy doing stuff, right? And parenting and then writing stuff and being on calls. And one of the things I am very aware of from my experience of indigenous traditions, and I don't like to fetishize the indigenous because I believe we're all indigenous and we all have access to, I think you call the mythic, archaic mythic, which I really like, is that in less complex, less modern societies, with less of a focus on the sort of twin of embodied wisdom we call cognitive complexity, this sort of desire to abstract, achieve, figure it all out, analyze, frameworks, lenses, I love that stuff too. And we both love that. We have a shared love of that stuff. That's great. But if we just do that, we miss out on all this rich experience of being in our bodies, which actually shift how we think and where we can go together as a group. And in other cultures with other frames and other forms of knowledge, which are honored, non-analytical knowledge, I have seen more regular rhythmical rituals for grief. And in fact, one of the things that I've been thinking of doing locally, hyper locally here, is having a monthly fire circle type situation. But rather than just, hey, we're all coming together to bless the turning of spring to whatever the thing is, right? The seasonal thing that's going on, actually make it about a kind of acceptance, grief, loss process, because there's so much loss that we're losing. And one of the things I think that comes to mind now, and by the way, thank you for presencing the grief for COVID, because I've got COVID. I just still got a little thin line on my lateral flow this morning, which is a right bummer, because we had tickets for an amazing Australian feminist comedian who's in Brighton tonight from 2 years ago, so can't go to that. But for me, I lost my grandmother from COVID in the very early days. Seen other friends have all sorts of issues. The numbers of kids who have lost caregivers, 5 million kids worldwide have lost a caregiver. And that amount of grief we have just for that alone, not just for that. Then we have Ukraine, and we're seeing kids, and the destruction of the European order of peace that since 1945. But we also have this huge loss, because I think we all sense that we're moving out of what could loosely be described, I think I've used this word a few times, advanced capitalism or high modernity. We can feel, I think I can feel, I'll be own my own feeling, I can feel that we're grieving for a world that was kind of okay, which for me was the 90s, because that's when I came of age, and 90s were amazing. And I've often talked about the fact we're sort of living in the 90s, and the 90s was like the peak of liberal, democratic, and convenient capitalism. So that's when people started flying all over the world with EasyJet, and brands became really cool, and I was in that industry. And I think we know that's been dying since maybe even 2008 crash, but it's been sort of held up by central banks and whatever. And I think COVID made us realize something really is shifting, and we don't know what's coming. And I think there's a lot of grief for that, that is unexpressed. And when we know things are unexpressed and unseen and unacknowledged, then they, what did Freud call it? The return of the repressed, right? Anything we repress returns in us all the time. So yeah, I'm just really present to how much grief I have to process for my own comforts and my age as well. I've been grieving my own youth in the last few months quite actively. So yeah.
I just wanted to, it's funny because in that perspective, I think we're both coming from opposite ends, which is interesting, because even though I did have some of these conflicts that you're mentioning, I remember thinking, I don't know, and I think you have, I mean, you've been doing your work for a long time, so I imagine I think the contradiction that I used to see used to bother me a lot. And it seems to me that the level of, we're just starting to notice our mistakes. So that for me feels better than being oblivious to the way we live. I think that at least it feels more comfortable. And maybe that's the time to, I don't know, maybe the time to bring the comfort with discomfort, because I actually think there's something to being comfortable in discomfort, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, is woven in the fabric of the female physiology. Even though we progress, or modernity or post-modernity, we have gone so maybe so much in our heads, or so much in a we're living so much outside of our bodies in some way, that we can override the body without even noticing it. And I mean, with illness, illness, if it's severe enough or annoying enough, it brings you to the body. However, something like the menstrual cycle, which it's something I'm going to bring in these conversations quite often and quite a lot. And maybe I should just explain this a little bit.
Please.
The reason why I'm going to bring it quite a lot is that for us, the most important thing is not just the feminine principle. However, it contained within the menstrual cycle is the archetype of the dance between the masculine and the feminine. So it contains the masculine principle of agency, of making the egg, of the follicular phase, of the ovulation, the whole thing. And it contains the death, it contains the descent, it contains the grief, it contains both. However, in modernity and in post-modernity, we have just been living as if we were only ovulating all the time, which we're not. And this contradiction that we have literally in our bodies, so there's two types of grief that I could speak of. One is, I actually think there is a lot of grief that's unnoticed and unrecognized in women that have lived their entire lives as if they were just going forward, as if they were just a line. Because we talk about the line, the masculine physiology more driven by testosterone, and the cycle and the female physiology, which is, and it's not just in the physiology, I mean, it's in the whole masculine principle and feminine principle. But we see how progress and this idea of, or the myth of progress, or whatever, however we want to frame it, and they have truths to it for sure, but has been ignoring the validity of the descent, of the grieving or composting or harvesting and decaying and aging and everything that you've been pointing to. And in a female trajectory, in her physiology, her rites of passage are woven into the physiology. I mean, a boy would go into the woods and do different things depending on the tribe, in the tradition that he's from. And a girl, she has the rite of passage inbuilt in her. So when she initiates her bleeding years, there is grief in leaving childhood, and it's just there. It's present. You can see it. It's very tangible. A girl is almost holding on to childhood when she becomes a woman, and she's starting to bleed, and she's starting to take care of her, have pads with her and concern her with things that she didn't concern before.
Yeah.
Then you have the mothering years, and before she becomes a mother, even in pregnancy and birth, I remember many stories actually of that could Okay, so I glitched a little bit. It's raining again. So then after when the woman is about to have a baby, for example, when she's pregnant, there are many stories that I've heard of, and actually it's happened with me, but I've heard very powerful stories of women that couldn't birth, that stayed in labor for a long time until they solved the grief of not being a sole agent anymore, of actually coming into terms with the loss of their own, being the most important person in your own world, because it's a massive loss. I mean, that's Absolutely. Gone forever. And I think because the baby also, some women grieve, they grieve the pregnancy. They love some don't, some have a hard time, but some have beautiful pregnancy, and they grieve the loss of the baby inside of them. So that's, again, a part of a woman's trajectory. And then when we go into menopause, we're grieving our youth in a very, very tangible way. Now, the problem with our culture is that none of these rites of passages allows us to grieve or invites us to grief. What it's done is the opposite. I mean, the babies, it's so inefficient to have a woman going into labor for so long that the solution that we came up with, the mind that thought of the solution cesarean section, and I'm not dismissing the need of cesarean section in some situations, but the mind that saw that the problem was maybe, well, there's many perceived problems with a natural birth, in the sense of inconvenience, length. So I'm just putting this in here. Is my internet connection unstable again?
It is, but it kind of came back, and just keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, not only we don't invite the grief, but we also have removed in some ways, we have dealt with it in a different way in regards to birth. And I just want to put another thing here, which is talking about birth with women. It's to use Jamie Wheel's language, is a sacred cow. It's a really hard thing to do. It's something that you don't talk about, because unless it's with your friends, or because any woman that feels, it's a very delicate topic to feel that you could have done something wrong, or maybe you feel wronged by the way you birthed your child. So I want to bring this here. Obviously, there's no judgment. Everybody that births a baby knows that it's a massive thing, no matter how you do it. And but I also think there is a thing that feels important, that is not the brushing under the carpet, the fact that there is grief to women that later on coming to terms with how the medical system is orchestrated in a way that it makes it really hard for a woman to give birth naturally. Lots of women actually, they grieve a lot that the fact that they couldn't birth naturally, or that the constructs in which they were brought up have immersed them in a way of thinking that hasn't allowed them to trust their body. There's grief in I'm not fertile anymore. Is this, am I glitching on and off? Is that what's happening? Oh, that's really annoying. Okay, I don't know how much you got of that. I'm gonna grieve the amount of sharing I was doing that you
It was
probably
quite
know.
interesting. It was a forced cycle within your linear explanation of something powerful, which was very interesting, because I was grieving as well. I was like, it's so good. And I actually wanted to present something you said yesterday in our prep around this call, which I then checked out with Alison, about these two distinct grief moments and feelings in the monthly cycle, which I found really beautiful and really opened up a lot of tenderness for my lady, who is in her end of cycle moment this couple of days, which is always a tender and sometimes fraught time in our family. Is the loss you said the loss in the couple of days after the egg is released and it isn't fertilized, used, and the life and then the deeper, do you say deeper? I think it's a deeper loss at the end of the cycle, when there's a whole cycle ending, which I found really beautiful.
Yeah, it's like a minor grief that some women experience actually as major, which is, when you're ovulating, sometimes you can experience as like you're in the height, and it's like a day, right? You're in the height. And then there's a come down, there is something. And women that start noticing their cycles, a lot of women notice that day after, and there is a wow, why can't I be? There's something, because also I think the grief is also there. Maybe there is also just the physiology of it. There's the death of an egg, and you're experiencing that, but also it's mirrored by society that, that phase, that peak, you're not there anymore. And you experience that over and over every month. And then obviously, again, you have the premenstrual phase, and then the menstrual phase, which would be the death of that cycle. And that's where the grieving and the shedding and all that happens. And then when you come out of it, I mean, it's the same as me sharing with those friends. When I was in the grief, I was in it. That's not the place where I'm going to come with my most brilliant idea. So the same when I'm actually in my in it, you know, in my bleeding or in my cave or whatever is happening, and I'm shedding my month and my decisions, and my physiology is responding to my choices, good or bad. And so when that's all happening, the amount that I can tend to this grief and give it time and honor it, I'm gonna see in the beginning of my spring, which is right after, you know, the beginning of the cycle, there's renewed energy to use to metabolize the what happened in the grieving process. The same way that I felt energized by when I could just let that out. I had space to be with what was in my heart, and I felt held in that. And then just noticing how much our culture doesn't allow us, women, I mean, maybe not even allow us. It's not out of malice, it's out of forgetfulness. Our culture doesn't see that. So therefore, there is a lot of grief for me in this. So there is grief in presencing that that's something that's I have to hide inside myself. It's a secret. And the way it shows up in my life is a secret to my close ones. And what I'm proposing is that actually it shouldn't be. It's there is a relevance. It's an important topic to be dealt in many levels, including in systemic levels, because it includes how we create systems and education and hospitals and everything that allows for that takes that into account, and gives space for this minor grief, which actually is training wheels for larger grief, for loss in all sorts of ways. Because I do feel that the more that I can be present, instead of trying to be out of what's happening in my cycle, I'm constantly there, reminded every month, even if I have a talk, if I have a retreat, if I have to be on. You know, actually, it's hilarious because every time I have to give a retreat, I get my period. The day that all the participants are going to arrive, which means that I can't be in the same way that I would be if I was ovulating. I just can't, and I won't. And because I'm not, the energy that I bring to the retreats or to the participants and to everything that I'm doing is informed by the energy that is in me, and I'm allowing it to be. I'm not fighting with it. But you know, it does have a certain weight to it. So it's not, we're not saying here our grief is super light. We're not taking it lightly. It's hard. Aging is hard. Giving birth is hard. You know, bleeding or having your period every month can be really hard. Like you said, in your relationship, you know, at times it has been really hard. So it's being with that I feel it's important. It's not trying to say that it's easy, because it's not easy.
I'd like to pick up on a meta of that sort of inner, as someone who theorizes about transformation, which is what we're talking about, the cycle of transformation, which you've helped me see is inherent in the female physiology. And then my work right up to systemic change processes and tools and approaches is that we, in the masculine mode that has been so dominant in these spaces for so long, we're so busy thinking about what comes next, the next big thing, the big idea, the disruptive innovation, the new design, the new intervention, the sexy, whatever that is, which we can liken to that feeling of that, you use this in your body, you went like this. And I'm like, yeah, this is exciting. This is what got me into that work in the beginning, right? My first proper job was an innovation consultant where you're helping people create sexy, new, exciting things. And what I realized as I deep dived into my own micro process of transformation, which includes the grief and the healing and the holding and the death and the loss and the crying and the endless, what seems endless amounts of it, is absolutely necessary for the rebirth of something that's fundamentally transformed from the old, not just an improved version of the old. And the systematizing, abstracting mind often gets caught into a set of biases and structures and frames where it assumes all that came before is good, and therefore we're just improving and intervening and perfecting. And this idea of progress, constantly And what I've learned as a student, artist, teacher, leader of breakthrough change, transformational change in an individual right up to a system is it cannot occur. It is impossible biologically and culturally and systemically impossible to occur without serious attention, time, and energy on accepting loss, processing loss, allowing the actual physiological release of ideas that we loved and, let's say, power structures we loved and positions of respect and reputation that we loved, particularly if we've got to a certain level of our life with that model at every level. And that this wisdom to know that when you relinquish the old of any fractal levels, there is grief. Even if you know it's no longer working. Even if I know that I am no longer in my late 30s and I can't go raving 3 times a week and still be a functioning parent and run a... Even if I know all of the outdatedness of it and it's no longer working for me, addictions, whatever, there is still a grieving, which for me is both a... And I think this is what you're pointing to. The grieving is both a process, but actually a physiological releasing, which is so clear in the shedding, as you called it. But it's not so clear, I don't think, when before you understand grief, that you actually, something is moving from you. It's a very interoceptively rich experience. And from the masculine side and the male side, we don't get taught any of that stuff. So a woman or someone in a body that has a period, it's inbuilt, as you said, but maybe not paid attention to or try to override or distract or dissociate or whatever. But in the male experience, my experience certainly, and see a lot of it, is that the shift of adolescence from childhood is into, oh, great, now I can go out. Oh, great, now I can have a phone. Oh, great, now I can go hunting with the dudes in the forest. Whatever, right? Version of that. Because your shift, as Robert Moore talks about, the shift of the man in the archetypes is from boy, pua, to warrior. Not father, warrior. Which feels more exciting, I think, to me. And like this idea that there's no loss. It's just an onwards and upwards. And yet, in one of my children, I see him who's very in touch with his feminine and actually has mentioned to me like an inner woman archetype person, like a version of him that he speaks from and to, which has actually inspired me to have that for me as well. And that's been very beautiful. I can see him in this sort of pre-teen phase where I know he's grieving as well for the loss of childhood innocence, the loss of the deep connection, whilst excited about what comes next and be able to do more stuff. And then the best, so absence of that level of wisdom as a child, the best a man can hope for, a man is taught grief is weak, grief is lame, grief is inefficient, grief is boring, whatever. So let's repress it. Let's say we actually go, oh no, we have to grieve properly. My dad died, my wife died. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is I'm going to have 6 sessions of counseling. That's going to be my grieving process. And then I'm reckoning by May 3rd, I'm going to be back. And what I've learned about grief is grief is about as non-linear as it can be. It's not neat. There's a logic to it, absolutely, but it doesn't appear logical. You're like, but I've cried already for my ex or for this. I've already done that. I've beaten my chest in the woods in the men's group. I broke down. But why am I still feeling this, as you said, seemingly endless aspect of loss and of sadness and grief? I think is loss, sadness, and something else. I don't know how to put words into it. And it's been a real doozy for me to, as a transformation person, to know that grief will respond to the transformational process, but it still won't obey it. And it might take longer than you think, and it might come back when you least expect it. And it might be present when you want to be, as you said, when you want to be really yang. So if I'm in my motivational speaker mode and suddenly I get a call from a child or something from difficult emotional thing. And I'm pulled into sadness or pulled into grief, pulled into loss. It's super inconvenient when I'm in my motivational or being paid to be motivational guy. And I think, as you're pointing to, when I accept it and be with it, I may not be like that, but I'll be something else, which is often really useful and powerful and effective and more vulnerable and more receptive and more unknowing and sitting in unknowing and sitting in beginner's mind rather than expert mind, or beginner's body. And that has real value. And though I'm often not paid for that part of me in advance of it occurring, it is often what people, particularly in the leadership development work I do, people then say was the bit that made most of the difference. They don't know it when they buy it. They don't know it when they're beginning, but all the masculine genius stuff is actually less useful than I felt I could cry. I felt I could grieve for no longer being a technical expert because now I'm a leader, or I'm 48 and I'm no longer the youngest, coolest person in the organization, whatever that is. That's been a great learning to me. And I still get my ass whipped on that, you know, that these qualities of showing up that are weighty. You can't pretend they're not weighty, are very powerful, and they're inherent in the human experience. And yet at the same time, as we talked about at the very beginning, we don't want to then trip out on that and dramatize it more and catastrophize it more and make it into our narrative and pull people. And that is a discerning wisdom of how to be present to what is, share it honorably, share it authentically, and not make it, not project it onto the group as the most important thing, intense thing, because I'm in pain or I'm in suffering. And when the way you described your engagement with your call was beautiful, because it was a balance. It was the masculine and feminine dancing together. You know, you didn't need to splurge it out and say, I'm here and I've got pain. Can you listen to me? It was invited. And then it had a really powerful, effective, and I would say necessary role in the group because it was there.
You said a few things, and I was going to say, I was reminded by just of Zach Stein's pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic. I don't even know if he calls that a model, to be honest. It just stayed with me. I've heard him talk about that a few times, and I think it really speaks to what we're saying. That so he says that the pre-tragic doesn't know much, doesn't know. The tragic also doesn't know, but it's in a different way. And then the post-tragic, it's exactly what you're explaining. It's a completely different felt experience. It's going through, sometimes the result might seem similar to the pre-tragic, but it comes with the embodied wisdom that you call the lived experience, which in the end it makes all the difference. I mean, I don't even know, to be honest, when we're talking about this, sometimes I go, for sure, this is obvious to most people, and I know that we live as if it's not obvious. Like we have this crazy collective agreement I don't know, in the postmodern world or whatever. But it's not just postmodern. I mean, it's modernity, and it's like the collective agreement that we just. It's a weird collective agreement because we pretend that emotions are not there, and therefore we are ruled by emotions. But we masquerade emotions as cognitive intelligence. It's just like we're either passive aggressive or we're distant, but we're distant on purpose. We want to leave somebody cold, or it's all ruled by emotions, but completely without the understanding that we're ruled by emotions. So pretending that we're not.
Without processing and being able to be with and accurately discern. One of the great scientists of emotion talks about the idea of emotional granularity, and it's actually been proven to lead to all sorts of good outcomes as a human. but the ability to actually discern the difference between rage and anger and outrage, and honor it, understand why it's there, sense make with it. This is for me really important, is sense making with our emotions. Why am I feeling rage? Is it rage? Hold on. No, I think actually beneath the rage is actually impotence. So one of my beliefs about the masculine psyche is that underneath a lot of its rage and shame, whatever, is actually a feeling of helplessness and impotence, which is the terrifying to the masculine that prides itself on strength and power, to feel no strength and power, which we often do, men, hello, when we're in a relationship that we can't control, because no relationship can be controlled. No authentic, interdependent relationship can be controlled. And when we know we can't control it with fixing it, mainly, or scheduling it, or organizing it, or doing any of the things that we usually do that work in machines, when in the workplace with machine thinking, the loss of power can be so profound to the man / the masculine within us, that often people don't stay in relationships. It's that profound because it's so intense. And that's one of the things I've loved about being with the same person now for 13 years and not running out and finding escape rooms out the back and safety rooms under the floor, whatever the metaphor is. But also being a father there is no escape. There is nowhere you can go but in yourself and into them. And one of the things I've found myself really realizing recently, which I've shared a few places, is how much sense making I have to do for myself and my children and my family system ongoingly, as I've got two boys who are at different stages, 10, 13, preteen, teen. We've got the world, you've got Ukraine, you've got all this stuff coming in, COVID, climate change. And so like the other day I was like, hold on a minute. I put my hand on my younger son as he's going to sleep, just sort of connecting with him, dare I say, doing a bit of healing. Not sure what that really is. Don't tell anyone. Then I was like, wow, I just got like what it must be like to be a young child, boy, girl, growing up in a world where the front of the possibility scape is not how it was for me, where you can do what you want. It's the world of IT, and it's the world, back to the 90s or the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I could feel like this constraint of our planetary limit with climate change, like the limits of modernity and all whichever forms of modernity you're talking about, the limits of all the types of modernity in their felt field as a constraint. And so I grieve was that. I was like, God, they growing up where they know, part of them knows that whatever job they do, it may not matter because there may not be an earth for humans to live on, or just a few humans, not maybe everyone. And sort of like the existential crisis that catalyzes, which we all have to go through anyway as a rite of passage, really early in your life. And yet also, as I'm super clear on, and this maybe links to what you're talking about, the tragic, constraint is the nature of creativity. It's the prerequisite for creativity and for freedom, actually, I think. And I think the masculine doesn't like constraint. And that's why it wants perpetual summer, let's go to Mars now, because we did this place, the next mountain, let's go. And rather than go, hold on a minute, let's be constrained by nature. Let's be constrained by climate change. Let's welcome that constraint in. And metabolize, a word we both use a lot, metabolize the constraint into adaptive forms that suit the world better and fit the world better. But it can't happen unless we welcome in that tragedy, constraint, crisis, drama, pain, grief. And it reminded me when you're talking about the tragic that I wrote in I think it was my first book, the beautiful Sufi thing, which I've really taken to heart in all our work, which is the heart is awakened to life by a sharp blow. As in, it is the nature of the pain, the suffering, the tragedy. The Buddhists have a similar thing. It's the nature of the suffering and the tragedy which catalyzes maturity, catalyzes our development. and that we can't actually engage in our own inherent capacity to pass through different rites of passage, initiations, invitations, developmental stages, if people love that kind of thing, without these what seem like irritants and constraints and frustrations. I have found personally, and working with many people, that those are the things that unlock the greatest evolutionary capacities we have ourselves as people. And that, I can't think of the metaphor, but like the coal, the dirty coal turns into diamond when we bring it in. And one of the diamonds that I've really experienced, which I think connects to grief, is compassion. And I've been really doing the deepest dive internally and in my theorizing around what compassion really is and where you feel it and how it shows up. And in some ways, I think compassion is grief metabolized. And then it shows up everywhere and it softens everything in a beautiful way, not in a you don't lose, you gain. And it's like the philosopher's stone of the alchemist. For me, at the moment, in this current stage I'm at, the philosopher's stone, the unlock of all alchemy and transformation is compassion. And it, for me, is like a living experience of interdependence with our dependents, like our kids. You're talking about the loss of freedom of independence when you have a child, for the woman and the man, I shall totally add. And then we can find our way to this interdependence, which is so interesting because it's a word that's been out there recently around reciprocity, mutuality, interdependence, particularly around indigenous knowledge and regenerative ways of living. But to actually experience interdependence, which I think grief is an unlock for. And there's a great teaching story. I remember the Buddha was a woman going, I've lost my son, I can't take it. And he says, go out and do some research, basically, on all the other people in the world. And she comes back, a few years later going, yes, I met so many people who lost their child as well. And the resulting sense of mutual compassion in interdependence was the healing of the loss. And there's something extremely powerful.
And it wasn't easy. And obviously,
none of that is easy. And super, as we come back to it, super inefficient. And super, what's the opposite of abstract? Like if you're in the abstracting, theorizing mind, and then you have to deal with this embodied feeling you've got of something wrong, something sad, something huge. What would you call that? Like it's inconvenient, but it's like landing you down when you want to be flying.
A burden or a weight or something.
Look what I wrote, my first note today. A burden. It's burdening you, isn't it?
Yeah, but the thing is, it's interesting because you use the word inefficient. I don't know if I like that framing, but I understand where you're going. But I'm just thinking, like, what is efficiency? Like, where are we going? Where are we going? Because this progress that's going somewhere that I haven't found where we're going, and this construct of this line that is going somewhere, and now we're actually going to Mars. I mean, in the name of efficiency, we have created cesarean sections to solve the problem of birth, which is, it required much more, like it requires presence, being with a woman, it requires less noise, it requires patience, it requires all sorts of annoying things. And then you have this birth that from some perspective is inefficient, but then it lands a child's first breath into the world from not in a state of flight and flight. Like it's not light, it's not threat, it's held in quietness. So then I'm not sure if this whole thing that would have seemed inefficient wouldn't have cascaded into, a whole different way of being a human, and the imprints that we have as the first,
that's what's missing from the efficiency. So for me, the efficiency paradigm is a machine term for it's the hypermasculine, which is machines work. There's actually, there's a physical formula for efficiency, which is work, output, energy in, and the efficiency is equals X, right?
Okay.
And then we do the same thing with humans, and we call it productivity. And countries worry about their productivity numbers, And that's all of this hypermasculine mind. And what I've learned myself is that when you let go of efficiency, you actually get what we call appropriateness or fittingness, or I use the word effective because it kind of works as a kind of flip from efficiency. Let's not be efficient, let's be effective. Let's have an effective birth, well, not an efficient birth. And effective would therefore mean children born in, let's say, darkness, water, love, community, the noise of community. I don't want to go too deep into that because I've been in multiple experiences of not that. But yes, the efficiency and the desire for comfort and convenience, which for me is the definition of capitalist modernity, is we will create a product at scale for your comfort and convenience. And that might mean so you can fly to your holiday home twice a month. That might mean so you don't have to deal with a headache, which, by the way, I'm not suggesting I don't take paracetamol. I've taken a few this week of COVID. None of this is against any of these comforts and conveniences. But when that desire for comfort, convenience, and efficiency blocks our capacity to be present to the full embodied gift of these, what did you call them? Weighty experiences, we lose so much on every level of loss.
And there's a couple of things that I wanted to bring in. I might, one is that just weaving first with the pain and paracetamol, all that, because my bias is so much to be with the pain that I notice that I forget that paracetamol exists as an option. And it's hilarious because when I take it, I'm like, it's a miracle.
Right?
I can pretend I'm not bound by my neck pain or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I can whatever. And I can see how you can totally get hooked in it. And I'm like, man, we're so screwed because, of course, if I had the bias of trying to avoid the pain, I mean, I would get myself in all sorts of troubles because, and I can see how, for a woman, again, taking the pill is more convenient. There's so many, there's pill now that you don't even bleed. So you're completely removed from your cycle because from the perspective of modernity, it's only an inconvenience. So there's no gain. So therefore, let's just take that out completely. And then we lose a whole embodied experience of a whole archetype or a way of being with reality that's not going to be available. And we don't even know that. So that's right. That. And maybe I'll just stop there for a minute. Is there anything you want to say?
Well, I want to just come into that because I was a medical person. I was a medical student, studied medicine, was on my way to being a psychiatrist. And then one of the triggers one of the slaps to my heart that awakened me through suffering and tragedy, it was being diagnosed after sickness in India when I was traveling there with what's called chronic pain syndrome or fibromyalgia. And the initial, first of all, no one believed it. The top consultants were like, it didn't really exist at that point. They were like, it's just make it up in your head. Stiff up. One guy actually said to me, stiff up a lip, old boy, do some swimming. I was like, wow. Okay. He was the top rheumatologist in one of the top hospitals in the world. Anyway, it awakened me to my body and I was all up here. I was studying elite university. I didn't really know anything about what was going on here ever, never really engaged in it. So it was like, wow, you are being brought, all your attention is being brought to the muscle pain, the IBS, the stuff, the the tiredness, the brain fog, as we've mentioned. And the initial temptation was, what can I take for this thing? What is there? What else could you give me? And I did take something for a few years that knocked me out. But I also knew that it was sleep, it was exercise, but it was really about emotional processing, trauma healing. And adverse childhood experience stuff, which is all about grief, all about wholeness, holing. I don't prefer the term healing. I prefer the term holing. It's about becoming whole. And I self-medicated myself off the medication. So I take nothing and haven't done for a long time. And if I'm in extreme pain, I will go first to like a cream that's topical, that's not ingested, like a menthol, cream, something just to loosen it. Or I'll do some stretching, do a yoga, do some qigong, whatever. But if it's really, really, really bad, I will take a paracetamol or something like that. And then my wife, Alison, had a very similar pace to you. She was like, I don't do any of this stuff. She's a healer. That's what she does. So why would she take anything convenient? And interestingly, through COVID and through menopause, she has opened up to the possibility that these tools are useful. They're there. They're available. There's nothing wrong with them inherently. And even today, she was like, I've got such a migraine. And I was like, did you take the migraine tablet the doctors gave you 3 months ago? She's like, no. I was like you. She's like, oh my God, a miracle. This thing's gone. I can think, I can be on my call with my client. So there's something there. It's so micro, right? But it's something super meta about the dance of what's this intense feeling. And we talked about Ukraine, so let's bring it. What's this intense feeling of Ukraine, seeing children, seeing Europe bombed, seeing just bullies doing bully things, and because they have a nuclear arsenal, there's very little we can do about it. What does that bring up in us? And let's not numb the pain by saying we've got all the answers or being angry, because that's anger is a great way of numbing pain, right? It's all that cortisol and it just slamps down the pain. I know that because I have been an angry person and still can be. And then also, so accept what is going on, how we feel showing up in the more feminine mode, and what else can we do? Can I put some money here? Can I put some money there? I put a Ukraine flag on my thing, solidarity. I wrote an article. I'm sharing it with, a whole mailing list of leaders about what Ukraine opens up about relationships and our relationships, and looking at Zelensky, etc. So that you don't have to ignore modernity, but we have to presence what's embodied first and acknowledge it and appreciate it and sit with it and articulate it. And honoring is really coming to me, and reverence. I think that's a word you've used in our chats. I love that word, a reverence for grief and what that unlocks for us.
Yeah, I like that. I love that. Reverence for grief. I think that a lot of our conversations that we've been having pre these recorded conversations is on that, on bringing, I think that's really important for me, is bringing the reverence back to elements that we forgot that have value, inherent value. They're valuable aspects of life. And I think that everything that you shared, before you said something about finding out what you're feeling. I don't remember how you said it, but now you also said about anger being a way of disassociating from the pain. And yes, I think that actually very few people, in my family, for example, if I just think of friends and family that don't work or are not involved in spaces that we are involved in, that spend a lot of time thinking, metacognizing or noticing how we feel, noticing how we relate, or whatever it is, for the benefit of ourselves, but also, of course, reflecting in everything we do. They have no idea. It's just really, it's the blaming. And I can see when I do it, when I blame somebody, the moment that I blame somebody or I choose guilt, I'm actually already escaping. That moment I already escaped. So taking the time to be with just the intensity in the physical experience, because it's intense. Emotional experiences are intense in the body. I remember when I got divorced from my ex-husband, I remember feeling, I had never felt grief in that way before. And I remember feeling I would choose to have a limb cut off over what I'm feeling at the moment. It was it was a no-brainer. And I was just like, and I don't want to say that lightly, because, I imagine this, I have my limbs. I don't want to, I don't want to enter in this discussion. However, the pain, it was just beyond anything that I had experienced before. And it's just, there was nothing that I could take for it. It was just it was overtaking me. So, and of course, grief we have all sliding scales. When I'm talking about the menstrual cycle, is actually a training wheel. Even, there's the saying in that when you enter menopause, I mean, menopause is the threshold, is being with this grief really massively, and then graduating from it to then serve your community and serve the larger whole. And you don't have any more children because you metabolize all that. And the menstrual cycle is so beautiful because it's minor griefs, you metabolize every month, it's minor griefs. And if you are with it, just present with it, what do I need? What do I need in this moment? Do I need to not go to that party? So I'm actually saying no, saying no to friends, saying no to that phone call. And it's hard. It's hard when you're young. It's hard when you're in a construct that doesn't value any of that.
Well, it's a practice, right? There's an inherent wisdom practice within the cycle. There's a practice for the next thing that's going to hit you. And how do we help other people? One of my great questions about the education system is, how do we help people practice wisdom practices for the next level of strength and difficulty? And in fact, I was just on the WhatsApp asynchronous messaging with my goddaughter, one of my godchildren, who is 20 and just started university, super cool London fashion design school, hipsters, parties after COVID, right? So explosion. And she was saying it's really challenging for me to know when not to go out, and just to, she's really been brought up in a wise community with a wise father, and she lost her mother, my dear friend, when she was 6. So she's gone through these grief cycles and pain cycles, and to hear her struggling with this, when do I give up the fun, the comfort, the summer, to have some winter, to have some autumn, to share, to own the autumn and winter. And part of the lockdown for me was about acknowledging my own desire for summer all the time, and including living in England where there's a winter that's really a lot, and to appreciate the mulching and appreciate the death and the decaying of the leaves, which I used to be terrified of. So I've always wanted to live in Bali, Goa, Ibiza, California. I almost bought a house in Rio because I've tried to escape this dark, deathly coldness. And I may still decide to live in a sunny place. I don't know. But for me, this granularity around this acceptance, and something about grief for me, which is so powerful, particularly if let's just presence the grief we have about Ukraine. How much of it is grief? How much of it is shame and guilt and thwarted intention and acknowledgement that we didn't do X and Y and haven't cared about a lot of other crises and wars and stuff and haven't read about it? It's so, grief is really, and when someone dies, I was sharing this with you yesterday, there's a difference between grief where I was somehow complicit in the loss being more than the loss, if that makes sense. Because I didn't show up fully. I didn't say what I had to say. I didn't do what I had to do. I wasn't honorable and wasn't mature. That grief for me has been far trickier, because it also includes regret and guilt and shame, than it has where I've shown up fully. And so I might tell the practical story. So my grandmother died 2 years ago, almost to the day, in the first, about 3 or 4 days before lockdown, the first lockdown. She'd been to an old people's home. Out of the 5 people who visited, 3 got COVID and died, I think. She's one of them. But it was before any of this whole, we didn't know what we were doing, right? And she was like a profound person in my life, one of the big people. And this Christmas before, so 2 months before, I had written her a poem as a Christmas present, honoring her in her wholeness, and particularly the fact that she was a force to be reckoned with, and not everyone could reckon with that force. And seeing her in her wholeness and acknowledging her, and I just saw her look up at me from reading it, tears in her eyes, and it was almost like, this is us, this is complete. your influence on me, my return back to you, the return path of reciprocity, right? That's the return path, which I really believe in, but that's a topic for another time. And so when she died, it was really sad, but it wasn't and hasn't been a wash over me, because I'd done the work, my own work and the showing up work. And in fact, back to my goddaughter, when I saw her grieve ongoingly for her mum, children are really interesting teachers in this, because they go big, deep into it, so out of nowhere, 3 minutes, and it passes. And then they're like, okay, what's for dinner? And us adults who are not practiced at grieving get really caught often for a long time. And as you said, but we think we're being brilliant, and we think we're somehow not our emotions because we're being clever, and suddenly we're driving to Ukraine to volunteer. I don't know, whatever the action is, right? So I think I feel like complete with this topic for me for now. I can feel myself returning on that journey. So I'm done. I'm checking out.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, no, I love that you said that, because I was feeling that. I was trying to feel into the energy, because you were starting on different topics, and I was like, we could go here, we could go there, and I was like, also 10 p.m. And also, but energetically, I think that we've done
a cycle, I would say.
Yeah, we've cycled in many places. I was noticing that maybe it's funny, maybe it was the masculine in me, or like, did we go where we needed to go? And I was like, I actually don't remember where we've been. We've been to many places, from inner to outer, to personal stories, to Ukraine. But I think that we've provoked. I think that seeing these conversations as thought provocations is the best way for me, because I don't want to have anything complete. I want to actually just stimulate the field with new possibilities and insights, and then see what happens, see what the fermenting. I do have one thing that comes up for me now. About the winter. It's about the winter, because you kept talking about summer and stuff. And I was going to say that, in the winter, which is the metaphor, which is the archetype of the menstrual cycle of death, which not the menstrual cycle, of menstruation, the bleeding and death, and the energy of winter. It is when the trunks of the roots of the trees are getting the nutrients, are
exactly.
So it's all working. It's invisible. It's
necessary.
It's necessary. It's a fundamental. If you have a good winter in the garden, you see how in spring everything is just beaming with life. It's winter is like, it's such a necessary part. And I think this whole idea that we can get the benefits of spring and summer without the winter, without the grieving, without doing the work and being with, is one of the traps of modernity and postmodernity. And I think that we are better, like we are more, I'd say more efficient in helping Ukraine or anybody.
More effective.
Anybody. You're gonna keep correcting me, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. We'll have another conversation on that.
Let's do a whole chat on that. But just as you said that, a good winter, I wrote down a good winter, having a good winter. And then I thought, winter is coming, and that's the beginning of the whole Game of Thrones thing, right? Winter is coming, and it's a bad thing. We don't want winter. The whole of that having winter. And I just thought, what's it like to have a reverence for winter and welcoming the winter? Winter's coming. Awesome. Great. And
maybe let's have we can have conversations on the reverence for winter and all that it represents in the psyche. I mean, there's a lot in there.
Great.
Okay.
So see you next time, people.
Yes.